Hey everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, we're setting aside the grand tapestries of empires and wars to look at something a little more personal, a little more peculiar. We're exploring the forgotten corners of the working world, the jobs, that time left behind, professions that were once essential, bizarre, or downright terrifying. And let me tell you, some of these careers were ingenious, some were stomach-turning, and all of them offer a fascinating glimpse into the lives of everyday people. So, before you settle in, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. But only if you truly appreciate our explorations here. And drop a comment below to let me know what part of the world you're listening from. It's always a thrill to see our global community gather. Now, go ahead and lower the lights. Maybe pour yourself a drink. Let's punch the clock on history's strangest careers. In an era before indoor plumbing, when cities were a fragrant medley of life and waste, one of the most vital and vilest jobs was that of the gong farmer. These weren't agriculturalists. They were the sanitation crew of Tudor and Stuart England, tasked with the nightly duty of emptying the city's privies and cesspits. The term gong was slang for dung, which tells you everything you need to know about their line of work. Operating under the cloak of darkness, legally restricted to work between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m., gong farmers ensured the public was spared the overwhelming stench of their labor. They would descend into brick-lined pits beneath toilets, often with little more than a ladder and a bucket, and manually shovel out months, or even years, of accumulated human waste. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was lethal. The pits were filled with toxic fumes like methane and hydrogen sulfide, and suffocation was a constant occupational hazard. The night soil, as it was euphemistically called, was then carted to the outskirts of town and sold to farmers as fertilizer, a perfect, if pungent, example of recycling. Despite their crucial role, gong farmers were social outcasts, often forced to live in designated areas away from polite society. Yet the job paid surprisingly well. If the gong farmer dealt with the byproducts of life, the resurrectionist profited from its end. These weren't miracle workers raising the dead, they were ghoulish entrepreneurs, digging them up. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the age of anatomical science was dawning, but medical schools faced a critical shortage of cadavers for dissection. Legally, they could only use the bodies of executed criminals, which were nowhere near enough to meet demand. This created a thriving black market for the recently deceased, and resurrectionists, or sack-em-up men, were its primary suppliers. Working at night, these men would slip into graveyards armed with wooden shovels to muffle the sound of digging. They targeted fresh graves, as the bodies were easier to extract and in a better state of preservation. With chilling efficiency, they would dig a shaft at the head of the coffin, break open the lid, and use a rope to hoist the corpse out. They were careful to leave behind clothes and valuables. Stealing property was a felony, but body snatching itself was merely a misdemeanor. The grim cargo was then sold by the inch to eager anatomy lecturers. It was a terrifying trade that led to public outrage. Families hired armed guards to watch over graves, and inventors designed intricate morgue safes, iron cages, built around coffins to thwart the body snatchers. Long before the piercing shrill of a digital alarm, how did the working class of the Industrial Revolution get to the factory on time? They relied on This was a human alarm clock, a profession that flourished in Britain and Ireland from the 18th century until the 1970s. For a few pence a week, a knocker-upper would walk the pre-dawn streets, ensuring their clients were awake for their early shifts. Their tools were simple but effective. Many used a long, lightweight pole, often made of bamboo, to tap on the windows of upper-floor bedrooms. Others preferred a pea shooter, firing dried peas at the glass to rouse the slumbering workers. A knocker-upper's route was a matter of trust. They had to be reliable, punctual, and persistent, not leaving a window until they were sure the client was awake. often waiting for a sign or a wave. It was a profession born of necessity. In an age where a missed shift meant lost wages, many knocker-uppers were elderly men or women looking to supplement their pensions, and some, like Mary Smith of London, became local legends with their pea shooters. The job quietly faded with the advent of cheap and reliable alarm clocks, but it remains a charming testament to a time when community and a simple knock on the window were all you needed to start the day. In the 19th century, medicine was a field of bold theories and often brutal practices. One of the most common treatments for almost any ailment was bloodletting, and the preferred tool for the job was the medicinal leech. This created a massive demand, and with it, a particularly wretched profession. The leech collector. These hardy individuals, often women and children from poor rural families, were tasked with harvesting leeches from marshes, ponds, and bogs. The method was as simple as it was agonizing. They would walk into the stagnant water with their bare legs, exposed, serving as live bait. The hungry leeches would attach themselves to the collector's skin. Once a sufficient number had latched on, the collector would wade ashore, peel off the bloodsuckers, and place them in a tin. It was a miserable, dangerous job. The collectors suffered constant blood loss, and the leech bites frequently became infected from the foul water, leading to festering wounds and disease. Yet, during the leech craze of the 1830s, the trade was lucrative enough to be a viable, if gruesome, way to survive. The leech collector is a stark reminder of the painful realities behind old-fashioned medicine. A profession that required sacrificing one's own blood for the supposed health of others. Of all the strange jobs in history, perhaps none is as haunting or spiritually fraught as that of the senator. This was a ritual practitioner, found primarily in parts of England, Scotland, and Wales, whose role was to ritually absorb the sins of a recently deceased person. When someone died, the family would call for the local senator, who was almost always an impoverished outcast living on the fringes of society. A loaf of bread and a bowl of ale or milk were passed over the body of the deceased, symbolically absorbing the dead person's unconfessed sins. The senator would then consume the food and drink, taking the spiritual burden onto their own soul. In doing so, they ensured the deceased could pass into the afterlife with a clean slate. For this service, they received a small payment, usually just a few coins. But the spiritual cost was immense. By consuming the sins of others, the senator became a vessel for the community's transgressions, a pariah who was feared and shunned. They were seen as perpetually damned, their own souls too heavy with sin to ever find peace. It was a profound, active social and spiritual transference, where one person's salvation was purchased through the damnation of another. While some jobs were relegated to the lowest rungs of society, others offered surprising prestige in the most intimate of settings. Enter the groom of the stool, one of the most coveted positions in the Tudor royal court. On the surface, the job was to attend the king during his most private moments of excretion, responsible for monitoring his bowel movements, a key indicator of health, and providing the necessary washing accoutrements. But this seemingly menial role came with unparalleled access and influence. The groom of the stool was the king's most trusted confidant. He was with the monarch in his private chambers, away from the prying eyes and ears of the court. This proximity made him the ultimate gatekeeper, a powerful figure who could control who saw the king and whisper advice directly into his ear. Men like Sir Henry Norris, groom to Henry VIII, became immensely wealthy and powerful, managing the king's personal finances and wielding significant political sway. The position was not about sanitation, it was about intimacy. In a world where access was power, being the man in charge of the royal toilet was one of the most powerful jobs in the kingdom. Before the digital age, the word computer didn't refer to a machine, it referred to a person. From the 17th century well into the 20th, human computers were the engines of scientific and engineering progress. These were teams of people, often women, who performed complex mathematical calculations by hand. They were responsible for everything from creating astronomical charts and navigational tables to calculating artillery trajectories during wartime. Working in large organized groups, they would break down massive calculations into smaller, manageable steps, with each person performing a piece of the equation. The work was tedious, repetitive, and required immense precision. At observatories, government agencies, and research labs like NASA's predecessor, NASA, these women were the unseen force behind major breakthroughs. They plotted the orbits of comets, aided in the development of the atomic bomb, and calculated the trajectories for the Apollo moon missions. Figures like Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson at NASA were brilliant mathematicians, whose work was essential to the space race. The human computer is a powerful reminder that for centuries, the most advanced processing power wasn't made of silicon, but of human intellect, dedication, and chalk-dusted fingers. In the days before refrigeration, keeping food and drink cold during the summer was a luxury that depended on another forgotten profession, the ice cutter. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, ice harvesting was a major industry in colder climates, particularly in New England and the American Midwest. When lakes and rivers froze over in the winter, armies of men would descend onto the ice. They used specialized horse-drawn plows to score the ice into a grid, then sawed it into massive, uniform blocks, some weighing up to 300 pounds. Using long pikes, they would float these blocks down channels of open water to a conveyor belt that lifted them into cavernous, insulated ice houses. There, the blocks were packed in sawdust to keep them frozen year-round. It was hard, cold, and dangerous work. Men could slip into the freezing water, and handling the massive slippery blocks often led to serious injuries. But the frozen water trade, pioneered by entrepreneurs like Frederick Tudor, became a global business. New England, ice was shipped as far as India and the Caribbean, revolutionizing food preservation and giving rise to chilled drinks and ice cream. The industry melted away with the invention of the electric refrigerator. But for a century, the luxury of a cold drink on a hot day was made possible by the back-breaking labor of men on a frozen lake in the rat-infested cities of Victorian Europe, where the bubonic plague was still a living memory. The rat catcher was a public health necessity. These weren't simple exterminators. They were skilled professionals who combined knowledge of animal behavior with a flair for showmanship. Dressed in dramatic attire, often with sashes adorned with the dead bodies of their prey, rat catchers would enter homes, sewers, and businesses to tackle rodent infestations. Their methods were varied. Some used trained ferrets to flush rats out of their holes, while others relied on their own specially bred terrier dogs, famous for their speed and ferocity in killing rats. One of the most famous was Jack Black, Queen Victoria's personal rat catcher, who became a minor celebrity. But the job was fraught with peril. Rat bites were common and could lead to serious infections, including the dreaded Weil's disease. Beyond catching, they also engaged in a grisly side hustle, selling live rats to the organizers of rat baiting, a popular blood sport where a dog was placed in a pit with dozens of rats, and bets were placed on how quickly it could kill them. The rat catcher stood at the crossroads of public health and public entertainment, a grim but vital figure in the constant war between civilization and the creatures that thrived in its shadows. Finally, we arrive at a job so bizarre, it sounds like a Monty Python sketch: the ornamental hermit. In the 18th century, it became a peculiar fashion among the wealthy British and German aristocracy to improve their sprawling, manicured estates by adding a touch of rustic, philosophical melancholy. The ultimate garden accessory was a real, live hermit. An advertisement from the time might seek a man willing to live in a hermitage on the estate, wear a camlet robe, and never, under any circumstances, cut his hair, beard, or nails. The hermit was expected to live in a simple hut, grotto, or folly, refrain from speaking to anyone, and be available for viewing by the landlord and his guests, who would observe him as a living piece of art meant to inspire contemplation on solitude and the passage of time. The contract often stipulated a term of 7 years. If the hermit fulfilled his duties, he would be rewarded with a handsome pension. Few, however, lasted that long. The profound isolation and bizarre conditions proved too much for most. The ornamental hermit represents one of history's strangest intersections of wealth, landscape design, and existential performance art, a job where the only requirement was to simply be, quietly and contemplatively, for the viewing pleasure of the rich dot in the sprawling fetid underbelly of Victorian London. Another type of scavenger made a living from what others threw away. This was the tosher, a sewer hunter who waded through the city's vast network of underground tunnels in search of treasure. Armed with a long pole with a hoe at the end, a lantern, and thick canvas trousers, toshers navigated the dark, stinking labyrinths of the sewer system. Their prize was anything of value that had been washed down the drains. Lost coins, silverware, scraps of metal, and even jewelry. It was an incredibly dangerous profession. Apart from the constant threat of disease from the raw sewage, toshers faced pockets of poisonous gas, sudden floods from rain or high tides, and collapsing brickwork. And of course, there were the rats, enormous aggressive sewer rats that traveled in packs. Despite the horrors, a good day's find could be worth more than a week's wages in a factory. The toshers were a secretive and tight-knit community, fiercely protective of their territories and knowledge of the sewer's hidden riches. They were the ultimate recyclers, turning the city's forgotten waste into their daily bread, one grimy treasure at a time. Imagine working in a cigar factory, the air thick with the scent of tobacco, your hands performing the same repetitive motion for 10 hours a day. The monotony would be crushing. To combat this, factories in Cuba, and later in the United States, employed a lector, or reader, perched on an elevated platform overlooking the factory floor. The lector's job was to read aloud to the workers. For a portion of the day, they would read from newspapers, keeping the workers informed about current events. For the rest, they would read from novels, serialized stories, and even political pamphlets. The workers themselves paid the lector's salary, pooling their money to hire someone with a strong voice and a gift for storytelling. The position was highly respected. Lectors not only provided entertainment and education but also became catalysts for political discussion, often reading from socialist or anarchist texts that fueled unionization efforts. Factory owners eventually saw them as a threat and replaced them with radios, but for a time, the lector was the voice of the factory, a literary companion who brought the world into the repetitive rhythm of manual labor. Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. With this cry and the ringing of a handbell, the town crier commanded the attention of the public. In a world before widespread literacy and mass media, the crier was the primary source of news and official information. Appointed by the town council, he would walk the streets, stopping at designated points to read out royal proclamations, local bylaws, market schedules, and announcements of public events. Dressed in elaborate livery, often a red and gold coat and a tricorn hat, the crier was a figure of authority and importance. His announcements began with the iconic "Oh yes," a Norman French word for "hear thee," and ended with "God save the king or queen." To get the job, you needed more than just a loud voice. You had to be literate, trustworthy, and able to endure all kinds of weather. While newspapers and later broadcast media made the role functionally obsolete, the town crier has survived as a beloved ceremonial figure, a colorful link to a time when news traveled at the speed of a man's walk, carried on the power of his voice. As dusk fell over the gaslit cities of the 19th century, another figure began his nightly rounds, the lamplighter. This was the man responsible for illuminating the city, one street lamp at a time. Carrying a long pole with a wick at the end, He would walk his designated route, lighting each gas lamp as darkness descended and extinguishing it at dawn. It was a job that required punctuality and physical endurance, covering miles of city streets every single day, regardless of the weather. The lamplighter was often seen as a romantic and reassuring figure, a bringer of light and safety to the urban night. Charles Dickens wrote about them, and they became a symbol of a particular urban charm. However, the job could also be dangerous, involving precarious ladders and the risk of gas explosions. The profession burned brightly for about a century before the advent of electric streetlights rendered it obsolete. Today, the lamplighter exists only in stories and as a nostalgic symbol of a world on the cusp of modernity. A world lit not by a switch, but by a steady, human hand. In the 19th century, a new science swept across Europe and America, promising to unlock the secrets of the human mind by simply examining the shape of the skull. This was phrenology, and its practitioners were the phrenologists. They believed that the brain was composed of different organs, each corresponding to a specific personality trait, and that the size of these organs was reflected in the bumps and contours of a person's head. A phrenologist would use their fingertips and a pair of calipers to read a client's skull, producing a detailed character analysis. They claimed to be able to identify traits like almativeness, the capacity for love, destructiveness, and benevolence. Phrenology became wildly popular. People consulted phrenologists for career advice, marriage counseling, and even to assess potential employees, though it was eventually debunked as a pseudoscience with no scientific basis. For decades, it was a legitimate, if misguided, profession. A fascinating example of how easily a compelling but baseless idea can capture the public imagination. Living in a royal court was a life of luxury, but also one of constant paranoia. For a monarch, the threat of assassination was ever present, and one of the easiest methods was poison. This gave rise to one of the most high-stakes jobs imaginable, the royal food taster. This was a person, often of noble birth, whose duty was to sample every dish and drink prepared for the monarch before it was served. It was a position of ultimate trust. The taster's life was on the line with every single bite. If a dish was poisoned, the taster would sicken or die first, alerting the court to the danger. While it came with immense prestige and the privilege of eating the finest food in the land, it was also a life lived on a knife's edge. The taster had to be constantly vigilant, watching the food's preparation and trusting no one. The role existed in various forms across many ancient and medieval cultures, from Rome to Egypt to the courts of Europe. A grim but necessary human shield against the ever-present threat of betrayal. While toshers scoured the sewers, another group of scavengers worked in the open air, braving the filth of the riverbanks. These were the mudlarks, a term for the desperately poor, often children or the elderly, who searched the muddy shores of tidal rivers like the Thames at low tide. They waded through the thick, foul-smelling mud, sifting through it for anything of value that had washed ashore or been thrown from ships. They looked for lumps of coal, scraps of rope, dropped coins, or bits of metal, anything that could be sold for a few pennies. It was a wretched existence. The mud was a toxic sludge of industrial waste, sewage, and decomposing matter. Mudlarks worked barefoot, their feet and hands often cut by sharp objects hidden in the muck, leaving them vulnerable to infection and disease. They were at the very bottom of the social ladder, their daily survival dependent on the scraps and refuse of a wealthy city that barely acknowledged their existence. The mudlark is a poignant symbol of urban poverty and the incredible resilience of those who found a way to survive in the most unforgiving of environments. Imagine trying to cross a busy Victorian street. The road is unpaved and slick, with a thick layer of mud, garbage, and horse manure. For the well-dressed ladies and gentlemen of the era, soiling their expensive shoes and long skirts was a major concern. This problem created a niche but widespread profession, the crossing sweeper. These were individuals, often children, or the infirm, who would claim a small patch of a busy intersection as their territory. Armed with a simple broom, they would wait for a pedestrian who looked like they could afford a tip. When one approached, the sweeper would quickly brush a clean path through the filth, allowing the person to cross the street without dirtying their attire. In return, they hoped for a small coin. It was a precarious and informal job, dependent on the generosity of strangers. Crossing sweepers became a common sight in 19th century cities, a small-scale service economy born directly from the failures of urban sanitation. Their brooms a tiny temporary solution to an ocean of muck. No figure is more emblematic of the terror of the Black Death than the plague doctor. With their long, bird-like beaked masks, wide-brimmed hats, and full-length leather coats, they are an icon of death and mystery. This bizarre costume was not for theatrical effect. It was a primitive form of personal protective equipment. The long beak of the mask was filled with aromatic herbs, spices, and straw, intended to filter out the miasma, or bad air, which was believed to be the cause of the plague. The waxed leather coat was meant to be impervious to these airborne poisons. Plague doctors were municipal physicians hired by towns to treat all citizens, rich and poor alike. Their duties, however, were often more administrative than medical. They recorded death tolls, witnessed wills, and performed autopsies, but their treatments, which included bloodletting and lancing buboes, were largely ineffective. More than healers, they became symbols of impending doom. The sight of a plague doctor approaching was a sign that death was near. Their haunting silhouette a terrifying fixture in a world consumed by pestilence. In the age of chivalry, a knight was a formidable fighting machine, but he did not go into battle alone. Behind every great knight was a dedicated and highly trained arming squire. This was far more than a simple servant. It was a formal apprenticeship for knighthood. A young boy, usually from a noble family, would be sent to serve a knight, learning the arts of war and the code of chivalry firsthand. A squire's duties were extensive. He was responsible for maintaining his knight's armor and weapons, ensuring they were clean, polished, and in perfect repair. He cared for the knight's war horses, the most valuable assets on the battlefield. In camp, he served his knight at meals and attended to his needs. In battle, he was a vital assistant, helping the knight don his heavy armor, handing him fresh weapons, and guarding him if he was unhorsed. The squire fought alongside his knight, proving his courage and skill. It was a long and arduous training, but if a squire served with honor and distinction, he could one day earn his own spurs and become a knight himself. From the sewers to the royal court, from the battlefield to the factory floor, these forgotten jobs paint a vivid picture of a world both strange and familiar. They speak of a time when life was harder, more precarious, and often shorter, but also a time of profound human ingenuity, resilience, and community. These professions were born from necessity, shaped by the technology and beliefs of their day, and ultimately made obsolete by the relentless march of progress. The gong farmer was replaced by the plumber, the knocker-upper by the alarm clock, and the human computer by the silicon chip. But their stories remain, whispers from the past that remind us of the hidden labor and the countless forgotten lives that built the foundations of the world we know today. They were the gears in a machine we've long since dismantled, but their echoes tell us who we were, and in doing so, help us understand who we are now. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the lost careers of history. It was a role so bizarre it seems drawn from fiction, yet it was a very real and very strange position in the royal courts of Europe, the whipping boy. The concept was born from the idea of the divine right of kings. A young prince was seen as a representative of God on earth, and his body was therefore sacred. To strike him, even for disciplinary purposes, was considered sacrilege. The solution, a boy, often of noble birth, would be raised and educated alongside the prince. They would become close friends and companions. But when the prince misbehaved, it was the whipping boy who received the punishment. The tutor would lash the companion in full view of the royal heir. The logic, however twisted, was that the prince's empathy for his friend would teach him to behave better. It was a career of vicarious pain, a psychological tightrope where friendship and punishment were inextricably linked, creating one of the most psychologically peculiar jobs in all of history. Now, let's leave the strange quiet of the court for the deafening roar of a naval battle in the age of sail. Amid the chaos of cannon fire, splintering wood, and shouted commands, one of the most dangerous jobs belonged to the youngest members of the crew, the powder monkeys. These were young boys, sometimes as young as 10, chosen for their speed and small stature. Their sole, terrifying duty was to run gunpowder from the ship's magazine as sealed, protected room deep in the hold-up to the cannon crews on the gun decks. They were a living fuse, scurrying through the heart of the battle, barefoot to avoid static sparks. The risk was unimaginable. A stray spark, a hot piece of shrapnel, or a direct hit on the magazine could mean instant obliteration. They were paid a pittance for a job that required the courage of a veteran, a constant high-speed dance with death in the cramped, fiery belly of a warship. Long before the Industrial Revolution mechanized textile production, turning raw wool into fine cloth was a complex hands-on process. One of the most crucial and foulest steps was fulling, a job performed by a fuller. Their task was to clean and thicken woven cloth, removing oils and dirt while matting the fibers together. The method was grueling and disgusting. The cloth was placed in a large trough and submerged in a mixture of water, a type of clay called fuller's earth, and a key ingredient, stale urine. The ammonia in the urine was a powerful cleansing agent. The fuller would then spend hours trampling on the cloth with their bare feet, pounding the filth out and compressing the weave. The work was physically exhausting and the stench was overwhelming. Fullers, like gong farmers, were often social outcasts, relegated to the outskirts of town where their odorous trade would offend the fewest noses. They were the anonymous artisans who turned rough fabric into luxury goods, through a process that was anything but refined. Let us return to the city, to a time before the steady glow of gas lamps or electric lights. As night fell, the streets of London or Paris transformed into a treacherous labyrinth of darkness, where robbery and misadventure lurked in every shadow. To navigate this world, you needed a guide, a small, flickering beacon of light known as a link boy. These were children, usually destitute, who would hire themselves out to pedestrians, carrying a lit torture link made of pitch and tow. For a small fee, they would light your way home, guiding you through the muddy, unlit streets and helping you avoid potholes and criminals. It was a precarious existence. The link boys were vulnerable to the same dangers as their clients, and stories abound of them leading patrons into ambushes set by thieves. It was a job born of pure necessity, a tiny flame of enterprise in the oppressive darkness of the pre-industrial city, a profession that was, in time, extinguished by the very progress it helped make possible in the bustling taverns of medieval England. A frothy pint of ale was a staple of daily life. But how could you ensure its quality? You turned to the ale conner. This was an official, appointed by the manor or town, whose job was to test the quality and strength of every new batch of ale. Their methods were often wonderfully strange. The most famous test involved the ale conner wearing a pair of leather breeches. They would pour a small amount of the ale onto a wooden bench and then sit in the puddle for about half an hour. When they stood up, the quality of the brew was determined. If their breeches stuck to the bench, it meant the ale had a high sugar content, a sign that it had not been properly fermented and was of poor quality. If they stood up freely, the ale was declared fit for consumption. The ale conner was part quality control, part public health officer, ensuring that the people's drink was both potent and pure, using little more than a strong constitution and a sticky pair of pants. Imagine a world without clocks, calendars, or even a shared sense of time. In many ancient and pre-modern societies, telling time was the responsibility of a specialist, the horologer, or water clock keeper. Before the invention of mechanical clocks, the most reliable way to measure the hours, especially at night or on cloudy days, was with a clepsydra, or water clock. This was a vessel from which water dripped at a constant rate, with markings inside, to indicate the passage of time. The horologer's job was to maintain this device. They had to ensure it was filled with clean water, that the spout didn't clog, and that the temperature remained stable, as this could affect the water's viscosity. In monasteries, the horologer was responsible for waking the monks for nightly prayers. In Roman courts, they timed the speeches of lawyers. It was a position of immense responsibility. To fail at the task was to throw the rhythms of civic and religious life into chaos. They were the silent guardians of the hours, measuring the flow of civilization one steady drop at a time. Finally, we turn to the world of art, to a job that required a very particular kind of endurance, the artist's model. Before the age of photography, artists relied entirely on live models to create their masterpieces. This was not a glamorous job of simply striking a pose. Models had to hold perfectly still, often in uncomfortable and contorted positions, for hours on end. The studios were frequently cold and drafty, and the pay was meager. It was a job that demanded incredible physical and mental discipline. But for those who did it, they achieved a strange kind of immortality. They are the anonymous faces and bodies that gaze out at us from the world's most famous paintings and sculptures. The woman with the enigmatic smile in the Mona Lisa, the muscular figure of Michelangelo's David, these were real people, whose patient stillness allowed for the creation of timeless beauty. They were the silent, living canvas upon which art, history was painted, their names forgotten, but their forms eternal. They were greasy, hot, and deeply comforting. You learned not to inquire about the contents. You just ate it and hoped for the best. And yes, people sometimes carved initials or symbols into the crust to stake their claim, a common practice among miners and laborers. In some regions, the crust was made extra thick along one edge, serving as a handle to be held with grimy hands and later discarded for the spirits, or, more realistically, for the rats. So, were they good? Frequently, yes. Were they a mystery? Always. But that was part of their appeal. You didn't eat a meat pasty for a sense of security. You ate it because it was delicious, and you were willing to embrace the consequences. In a world where dental hygiene involved rinsing with wine and hoping for a miracle, candied fennel seeds were the medieval equivalent of breath mints. These tiny, sugary, and vaguely herbaceous morsels were part confection, part digestive aid, and part dental risk, all contained in a single, strangely satisfying crunch. The seeds were coated in a hard sugar shell, a process that was no simple task. In the Middle Ages, sugar was an imported luxury that had to be boiled, beaten, and applied by hand, which means someone, somewhere, had immense faith in the potential of these little snacks. They were particularly fashionable in noble households, where a small dish might be offered to guests after a meal to cleanse the palate and likely to distract from the lingering taste of mutton. Flavor-wise, fennel seeds possess a distinct, licorice-like quality. You either adored them or politely swallowed them whole while nodding appreciation. The sugar coating tempered the flavor, but that unmistakable herbal kick was always present, leaving you feeling both sophisticated and slightly bewildered. Candied seeds also served a practical purpose, aiding digestion. It was believed that fennel helped calm the stomach, especially after a substantial meal featuring multiple types of fowl and a concerning quantity of mead. Think of them as a medieval cross between chewing gum and an antacid, but with a much higher chance of chipping a tooth. And they were indeed hard, like crackle reef furor, confident hard. You didn't munch on candied fennel seeds thoughtlessly. You approached with caution, testing one gently before committing to a full bite. It was a risk-reward scenario with every seed. While the wealthy enjoyed them like medieval Tic Tacs, commoners sometimes had access to imitation versions, typically made with honey, crushed herbs, and a good deal of optimism. It wasn't quite the same, but it was close enough for pretense. In the grand scheme of medieval junk food, candied fennel seeds were small but significant. They didn't satiate your hunger, but they left a pleasant aftertaste and created an illusion of refinement, even if you were caked in mud with goose grease on your tunic. If medieval desserts had a star player, it was the honey cake. This sweet, dense confection, prone to adhering to everything but your expectations, was the result of ambitious bakers working in an era when sugar was largely confined to royal treasuries. Honey was the sweetener for the masses, assuming those masses owned beehives, had access to them, or were brave enough to climb a tree and risk facial stings. These cakes were typically crafted from flour, water, and heaping spoonfuls of honey, or at least what passed for spoonfuls in a time when spoons were often repurposed for sibling disputes. The outcome was a firm, chewy slab that could serve as either a delightful treat or a makeshift doorstop, depending on how long it had been left by the hearth. Spices were occasionally incorporated, if the household was prosperous or simply showing off. Nutmeg, cloves, or cinnamon could lend the honey cake a touch of flair, and by flair we mean the ability to make the entire village gossip about your recipe for a week. Dried fruits were also added if they hadn't already been purloined by local children or fermented into wine. Honey cakes were a staple at feasts, festivals, and weddings, primarily because they could be prepared in advance, had a long shelf life, and could withstand being dropped, stepped on, or even thrown during a minor food fight. They also functioned as gifts, bribes, and, on occasion, passive-aggressive gestures. Here, I baked this for you. It's sweet, unlike your disposition. Structurally, they were far from delicate. Many resembled dense bricks, and slicing one required a strong knife and a silent prayer that no one was watching you struggle. Eating them was a bit easier, but a light, fluffy bite was out of the question. These cakes were engineered for medieval existence, tough, resilient, and coated in enough sticky honey to make your hands feel as if you'd lost a skirmish with a beehive. But they were satisfying. They tasted of warmth and indulgence, of a rare moment when you weren't chewing on salted barley or chasing rodents from your pantry. They were joy encased in sweetness, with just enough chewiness to count as a workout. Fried fish skin cracklings were perhaps the most surprisingly delicious snack to come from a culture that also considered eel pie a viable culinary concept. These crispy, salty strips were not elegant, but they were a model of efficiency. Waste not, want not was a guiding principle, especially when dealing with a fish that smelled like it was silently judging you. Let's be realistic. No one intentionally set out to invent this. It's more probable that a frugal cook, faced with a pile of discarded fish skins, had a moment of inspiration. What if I just fried these? A bit of hot fat later, and a culinary footnote was born. Fish skin was abundant, particularly in coastal areas or near rivers where herring, cod, or whatever else had been caught was processed. The flesh was used for stews, the heads were given to the cat, and the skins were tossed into a pan of hot oil and sizzled into crispy submission. The result was unexpectedly addictive, a thin, brittle snack that crunched like a dry leaf but tasted of the concentrated essence of the ocean. A dash of salt took it to the next level. A touch of garlic or herbs. Now you were approaching culinary brilliance. These cracklings were more than just tasty. They were practical. They were lightweight, relatively non-perishable, and high in fat, exactly what a medieval body needed after a day of hauling wood or defending livestock from a neighbor's livestock. Soldiers packed them, sailors subsisted on them, and peasants sold them outside taverns for a small profit. and the simple pleasure of giving drunk people something loud to chew on. Did they sometimes retain scales? Yes. Did they occasionally curl into strange existential shapes? Also, yes. But by medieval standards, they were almost sophisticated, crispy, savory, and unlikely to cause dysentery. The only significant downside was the smell. A batch of these could announce its presence from 3 huts away. If you fried them indoors, your home would smell like Poseidon's laundry for a week. But you'd be forgiven, because they were delicious. When life gave you stale bread and lukewarm beer, you didn't despair. You created the most archetypal medieval snack imaginable. Bread soaked in ale, known by various names, including SOPs or trench toast. This humble concoction was the original comfort food. Imagine French toast, but stripped of the eggs, sugar, cinnamon, and general happiness. Here's the method. You took day-old bread, the kind with the density of a building block, and submerged it in a bowl of ale. Not a fancy craft ale with hints of citrus, but a flat, low-alcohol brew made in someone's smoky back room with questionable hygiene. The bread would absorb the ale like a sponge with deep-seated trust issues, softening and swelling from a jaw-breaking crust into something vaguely chewable. Was it delicious? Under the right conditions, with a positive attitude and low expectations, it was, in a way. It was warm, bready, and possessed the faint bitterness of fermented grain, meaning it didn't actively assault the palate. This snack was particularly favored by the working class, who lacked the time for multi-course meals or formal cutlery, but still required calories that didn't put up a fight. Bread soaked in ale was quick, filling, and just messy enough to feel like a genuine departure from daily labor. Sometimes, people would add enhancements, a sprinkle of herbs, a bit of cheese, or a fried egg if the chicken was feeling cooperative. On feast days, you might even be treated 2 sops soaked in spiced ale, which usually meant the cook had discovered a stray nutmeg, shaving, and felt inspired. Like many medieval dishes, this one served a dual purpose. It was not only food, but also a method for stretching resources. Bread too hard to chew? Soak it, ale beginning to turn sour. Pour it over bread, and call it a culinary choice. Waste was, for the inexperienced, the only real drawback was its lack of portability. Once soaked, the bread became a sort of sloshy poach brick. It had to be eaten quickly to avoid ending up with a mushy sponge and a 1,000-year-old metaphor for disappointment. Still, on a cold evening by the fire, nothing could beat a slice of ale-soaked bread and a moment of quiet. If you've ever gazed at a piece of bread and thought, this would be improved by being submerged in alcohol, then congratulations. You share a sensibility with the medieval aristocracy. Sops and wine were one of the more refined or perhaps bizarrely specific snacks of the Middle Ages. It was technically a dessert, or maybe just an experience. The principle was straightforward. Take bread, preferably toasted, or at least not completely fossilized, and dip it in wine. This wasn't just any wine, of course. It was typically mulled, sweetened, or spiced wine, warm, aromatic, and barely concealing the fact that it had been stored in a clay jug since the previous harvest. Once the bread was thoroughly saturated, it was served as a soft, spoonable treat. Nobles considered it elegant. Everyone else silently questioned if the cook had simply exhausted all other ideas. This was not a dish to be eaten with your hands. It was the kind of food you consumed with a spoon, very slowly, while feigning interest in lute music. It made appearances at banquets, late-night feasts, and the sort of tense dinners where politics were off the table, so soggy toast was passed around in a goblet instead. When executed well, sops and wine were warm, comforting, and mildly intoxicating, a gentle conclusion to a heavy meal. The wine provided richness, the bread offered texture, and the spices made you feel part of something more sophisticated than it actually was. When done poorly, it was just wet bread in a bowl. No amount of cinnamon could mask the sensation that you were chewing on a medieval culinary error. Sometimes dried fruits or nuts were added for extra flair, sometimes cheese, and occasionally an entire egg. At that point, it ceased to be a snack and became a guessing game. Peasants created their own versions, typically using cheap vinegar or ale instead of wine. It wasn't dessert. It was dinner, or breakfast, or whatever you could call a meal that left you both full and bewildered. Still, sops and wine had endurance. They were warm, filling, and offered medieval people a taste of luxury, even if it resembled a sponge soaked in mulled regret. In the Middle Ages, dried fruit was a highly valued treat, sugary, exotic, and with a shelf life long enough to endure. An entire crusade. But let's be clear, this was not the trail mix of today, with its convenient resealable bags. Medieval dried fruit had a singular purpose: to last. Flavor was secondary, the texture was aggressively tough, and dental distress was practically guaranteed. The usual varieties were present: raisins, figs, dates, and, for the truly wealthy, imported prunes. These fruits were sun-dried, smoke-dried, or, in some instances, simply left on a windowsill until they could no longer be classified as moist. They emerged wrinkled, leathery, and alarmingly dense like edible time capsules from the last harvest. The major advantage of dried fruit was its sweetness. The concentrated sugars transformed these shriveled morsels into medieval candy. Nobles adored them, monks stockpiled them, and children regarded them as rare treasures from the kitchen. The downside: chewing them was a battle against your own jaw. Figs contained seeds that could serve as medieval dental floss. Dates were so sticky they could fuse your molars together. Raisins would get lodged in your teeth for hours. There was no such thing as snacking discreetly. Still, dried fruit had its place. It was incorporated into pies, mixed into porridge, or chopped and added to honey cakes to create an illusion of culinary diversity. The wealthy might wrap it in pastry, sprinkle it with rosewater, or soak it in wine as if trying to impress a visitor from Florence. For commoners, obtaining dried fruit was a rare event, usually reserved for a holiday, a wedding, or the one day a year someone remembered your existence. On such an occasion, you would eat it slowly and reverently, possibly while hiding in a barn to avoid sharing. Storage was simple. Dried fruit did not spoil easily, and was often kept in small cloth bags or clay jars. It would harden over time, but that only made it a longer-lasting snack or a potential projectile if you were inventive and had younger siblings. In essence, dried fruit was sweet, luxurious, and slightly perilous. It stayed with you sometimes. Quite literally. You awaken with a hunger for something substantial, something fried, something that might have a bite of its own. Enter the blood pudding ball, a medieval snack so dense, so audacious, and so unapologetically rich in iron that it makes modern sausage rolls seem like delicate pastries. Originating from the noble tradition of utilizing every part of an animal, these savory spheres were a testament to the principle of waste, not want not, even when the thing you weren't wasting was blood. Let's break it down. First, you procure fresh animal blood, typically from a pig, though any blood would suffice in a pinch. This is then combined with oats, onions, and suet beef fat, and seasoned with spices. Once this grim mixture achieves the perfect level of morbid stickiness, it's formed into balls and fried in hot fat until the exterior becomes a crispy shell with something to prove. The outcome is a cluster of dark, crunchy orbs of protein-dense sustenance with a deep, earthy flavor, which is a polite way of saying you'll taste iron and an air of mystery for the rest of the day. They were best enjoyed hot, straight from the pan, although they were sometimes consumed cold if your hunger surpassed your aversion to congealed fat. Nobles might enhance them with pepper or serve them alongside eggs and ale. For peasants, they were simply a welcome alternative to another meal of boiled cabbage. Blood pudding balls were not sophisticated, but they were immensely practical, easy to transport, high in calories, and shockingly filling. 2 of them could serve as a full lunch. 4 of them meant you were likely a blacksmith, or in the middle of a dare. These snacks were a common sight at fairs, markets, and roadside stalls, where the air was thick with the smells of livestock and ambition. They were especially popular in colder climates because nothing warms the spirit quite like fried coagulation. Naturally, blood pudding balls were not for everyone. Some found the texture off-putting, while others were unsettled by the concept itself. But in a world where survival was paramount and flavor was a distant consideration, these meaty morsels rightfully earned their spot in the medieval junk food hall of fame. Forget your preconceptions about pancakes. These were not the light, fluffy stacks drizzled with maple syrup and topped with whipped cream. Medieval pancakes were thinner, chewier, and cooked in enough lard to make your arteries contemplate an early retirement. But they served their purpose. And in a world where the alternative breakfast was often a thin, sad soup, they felt like a genuine treat, made from a simple batter of flour, eggs, and water or ale. These pancakes were poured onto a searing hot iron griddle slicked with bubbling pig fat. There were no non-stick surfaces or portion guides. You just ladled the batter and hoped for the best. The result was a flat, irregularly shaped disc with crispy, browned edges and a slightly tough center. The kind of pancake that could endure a journey on horseback and still be mostly intact upon arrival. Sometimes it was a bit burnt, sometimes a bit undercooked, and sometimes, charmingly, both. The flavor was dictated by what was available. A touch of ale lent a pleasant tang, a spoonful of honey was a luxury, and a sprinkle of herbs or onions was an adventure. Most of the time, however, it was just pancake and grease, served hot and consumed with the urgency of someone fleeing a tax collector. These pancakes were a democratic food. Everyone ate them. Peasants, nobles, monks, and merchants. Some layered them with cheese, others dunked them in broth, and many just rolled them up and ate them on the go. You could enjoy them sweet, savory, or charred beyond all recognition. If you had leftovers, you could stack them and pretend they were a cake, or perhaps a piece of armor. They were particularly popular during Lent and other periods of fasting. When meat was forbidden, pancakes provided a loophole, fried filling, and somehow both modest and indulgent. Plus, they were excellent vehicles for disguising other ingredients that had no business being in your meal. And while they may not have been aesthetically pleasing, medieval pancakes had resilience. They didn't require accolades, they just needed a hot pan and a hungry stomach. Somewhere between a snack and a holy sacrament lies the medieval wafer, a thin, crisp, and suspiciously light biscuit that straddled the line between dessert and dental hazard. Wafers were ubiquitous, sold outside churches, at village fairs, in the hands of monks, and occasionally found floating in soup like a flat, sacred crouton. To be clear, we are not discussing chocolate-coated cream-filled confections. Medieval wafers were composed of flour, water, eggs, and little else. If one was feeling particularly extravagant, a bit of honey or rosewater could be added, but most adhered to the basics. A thin batter was poured onto hot metal wafer irons and pressed between 2 scorching plates, similar to a medieval panini press. The outcome was something that looked like it belonged in a communion service and tasted like crispy, edible paper with aspirations. Wafers were popular because they were portable, quick to produce, and most importantly, could be sold in large quantities for a decent profit. Vendors would station themselves outside churches on feast days, offering stacks of warm wafers to the devout as they departed from Mass. By now, "Sin later" was not the official slogan, but it captured the general atmosphere. They were often embossed with religious symbols, floral designs, or the faint impression of a saint's face, depending on the design of the iron mold and the baker's level of exhaustion. These patterns did nothing to improve the flavor, but they provided something to contemplate while you chewed thoughtfully and feigned satisfaction. Structurally, wafers were exceedingly delicate. They would crack if you looked at them too intently, and would shatter if you attempted to break them cleanly. Storing them was a challenge, and transporting them was even more difficult, making outdoor consumption a high-stakes activity involving crumbs, wind, and inevitable regret. Still, they were widely cherished. Light, crispy, and vaguely festive, wafers were the medieval way of treating oneself without completely disrupting your digestion or your budget. For the nobility, they might be served stacked with fruit or layered with soft cheese. For everyone else, they were sold by the dozen at street stalls and eaten immediately before they could disintegrate into edible confetti. Suck it, even the name has a sticky quality. This medieval delicacy was essentially fruit that had been boiled into submission, submerged in syrup, and preserved in a jar like a sweet edible hostage. Imagine candied oranges, dates, or ginger, all coated in enough sugar to make your teeth ache and your conscience whisper, "You probably shouldn't be eating this." But you ate it anyway, because it was delicious, likely imported, and you had few other options. Suck it was not for the common peasant on their seventh onion of the week. This was a top-tier snack, the kind of luxury served in noble halls or presented as a gift by the wealthy to convey the message, "I appreciate you, but not enough to grant you land." Sugar was a costly commodity, and fresh fruit was seasonal, so suck it was reserved for special events like weddings, royal visits, or a particularly indulgent Wednesday if you were exceptionally rich and lacked self-control. The preparation was an ambitious undertaking. First, the fruit was boiled in a syrup of honey, or if your spice merchant was in your debt, refined sugar. It was then drained, allowed to dry slightly, and the process was repeated multiple times because a single boiling was insufficient. This wasn't merely fruit preservation. It was a full-scale war against moisture. The final product was a glossy, jewel-toned morsel of candy, chewy, intensely flavored, and so sweet it could likely be weaponized in sufficient quantities. Some versions remained soft and syrupy, served in elegant glass jars. Others were dried, rolled in additional sugar, and distributed as dainty cubes of medieval hypoglycemia. But make no mistake, suck it was a status symbol. It announced that you had access to sugar, trade routes, and at least one servant whose sole duty was to stir things that resisted being stirred. Trays of suck it were circulated after banquets like edible currency. Guests would take a single piece, smile graciously, and immediately regret not taking 3. As for the common folk, they observed from the kitchen and perhaps licked a spoon when no one was looking. So, was it worth it? In all honesty, yes. Suck it was one of the few medieval snacks that truly felt like a dessert. It was rich, refined, and just ostentatious enough to compensate for the fact that dinner had involved something boiled. Fried eel, the grand finale of our medieval junk food tour. This dish was so inexplicably popular that it transitioned from peasant hearths to royal banquets without ever pausing to ask, "Am I truly the best choice available?" The answer was a resounding yes. Eels were abundant in medieval Europe. Rivers and streams were teeming with them, making them easy to catch, inexpensive to cook, and, when fried, surprisingly crispy, despite being slippery when raw, unexpectedly. Bony, and shaped like the antagonist in a fish-themed horror film, eel was consumed by the ton. Why? Because it was flavorful, and more importantly, it wasn't turnip stout to prepare it. One first had to capture the eel, a task typically undertaken at night, when they slithered through shallow waters like sentient noodles. This was followed by the unpleasant job of skinning them, an endeavor less like prepping a fish and more like wrestling a wet, defiant rope. Once the eels were subdued, they were chopped, seasoned if you were feeling daring, and plunged into hot fat until the skin crisped up and the flesh firmed into something passably appealing. The final product was a crunchy, savory bite with a rich, slightly oily taste, like the result of a culinary identity crisis between calamari and chicken in a tavern kitchen. Fried eel was a staple at fairs, feasts, and roadside inns, and, remarkably, it was even consumed during religious fasts. That's right, eel was not technically classified as meat, so it navigated dietary restrictions as deftly as it navigated a riverbed. Monks ate it, nobles brandished it, and kings had it baked into pies and paraded through banquets like the sea serpent it aspired to be. Sure, it was full of bones, and yes, it occasionally twitched long after it was supposed to be dead. But if you could move past those details and the unsettling feeling that you were eating a character from a cautionary folktale, fried eel was genuinely delicious. With its crispy skin, tender meat, and just enough grease to make you feel like you were living dangerously on a Wednesday afternoon, it was a delicacy. Today it might seem outlandish. Back then, it was a slippery little miracle that kept stomachs full and menus interesting. In the ancient world, Mesopotamia was a land where mystery and mythology converged, and this was never more apparent than in their perception of dreams. For the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, a dream was not a random private mental event. It was a divine message, a supernatural communication sent directly from the gods to the sleeping mind. To disregard a dream was akin to leaving a message from the god Enlil on a perilous oversight. By approximately 2500 BCE, Mesopotamians had established a sophisticated system of dream interpretation, meticulously recorded on clay tablets in cuneiform script. These were not mere curiosities. They were vital tools used in governance, medicine, and religious practice. A king might postpone a military campaign if a disturbing dream hinted at a negative outcome. A farmer might delay planting if he dreamt of a goat soaring through the sky. They believed the universe was in constant communication. One simply had to listen with closed eyes. Professional dream interpreters, known as BR priests, were the ancient equivalent of Freudian analysts, albeit without the couch. They were educated in vast libraries of omen texts, such as the Iker Zak, a detailed dream manual that catalogued countless dreams and their corresponding meanings with an often strange but specific logic. Dreaming of eating dates was a good sign. Dreaming of losing your teeth foretold a death in the family. Dreaming of an intimate encounter with a goddess. Congratulations, you were either divinely blessed or cursed with hubris. These dream books did not propose to guess meanings. They presented them as cause and effect, as if dreams were solvable equations. A equals B. Seeing a snake meant betrayal. Falling from a roof signaled an impending lawsuit. The dream world operated on a divine logic, one far more arcane than human reason. But the Mesopotamians went beyond mere interpretation. They also practiced dream incubation. If a ruler sought guidance, he might sleep within a temple under specific ritual conditions, fasting, cleansing, and offering incense while awaiting a revelatory dream. The belief was that certain sacred environments could create a stronger, clearer connection to the divine, free from nightmares about inebriated goats. For Mesopotamians, the dream world was not a puzzle to be solved, but a realm to be navigated, with respect, caution, and a very large library of clay tablets. They were convinced the gods were always speaking. You just had to be asleep to hear them. In ancient Egypt, dreams were not simply nightly phantoms. They were considered sacred narratives in motion. The Egyptians held that dreams were messages from the gods, the ancestors, or even from one's own Ka, the spiritual double of a person. Every dream, whether good or ill, was believed to carry a specific intent. It could warn, bless, instruct, or terrify. By the era of the New Kingdom, around 1550 to 1070 BCE, the Egyptians had started to document their dream interpretations in what are now some of history's oldest dream manuals. One of the most renowned examples is the Ramesside Dream Book, inscribed on papyrus and found in the village of Deir el-Medina. This was not casual reading. It was a divine diagnostic guide, listing hundreds of dream scenarios and their outcomes, classified as either auspicious or disastrous. The logic, however, was not always straightforward. For instance, if a man dreamt of eating crocodile flesh, it was interpreted to mean he would become a high-ranking official. This may seem strange, but in Egyptian cosmology, the crocodile was linked to the god Sobek, a symbol of strength and authority. To consume the crocodile was to absorb its divine qualities, an omen worthy of a promotion. Each entry in the dream book began with the phrase, "If a man sees himself," followed by a symbolic scene. These were not arbitrary guesses. They were derived from centuries of ritualistic knowledge, personal visions, and temple traditions. The interpretations were often binary, marked as good or bad, in red and black ink. If your dream fell into the bad category, it was time to burn some incense and implore a priest for intervention. Priests in temple complexes, particularly those dedicated to healing deities like Serk or Thoth, sometimes provided services. In dream incubation, supplicants would sleep within the temple, hoping to receive guidance or healing through their visions. The goal was to open a channel to the divine through purification, prayer, and controlled sleep. This was not mere superstition. It was a fusion of healthcare, divination, and theology conducted during a single night's rest. Dreams also had a significant influence on magic and medicine. Amulets might be prescribed to ward off recurring nightmares, and specific rituals could be performed to erase a bad dream, much like one would nullify a curse. For the ancient Egyptians, the sleeping mind was never dormant. It was a stage where gods, demons, and the spirits of the dead could manifest, offering insights into hidden truths, so if you had the wisdom and a priest to decipher them. In the ancient Greek world, dreams were more than just divine communications. They were considered clinical consultations with the gods. Central to this belief was the practice of incubation, a ritual in which individuals would sleep inside a temple with the hope of receiving a healing vision. No deity was more intrinsically linked to this practice than Asclepius, the god of medicine, at temples known as Asclepia, which were found throughout the Greek world from Epidaurus to Pergamon. The sick, the hopeful, and the desperate gathered to seek cures. But instead of being prescribed medications, they were prescribed sleep, sacred, intentional, and conducted under specific spiritual protocols. Before entering the temple's sleeping chamber, or abaton, an individual would undergo a process of purification, which included bathing, fasting, and sometimes animal sacrifice. Only after completing these rituals could they lie down on a stone pallet and await the god's appearance in a dream. The results? According to ancient inscriptions and testimonies, some patients dreamed of Asclepius healing them with his staff, or of his sacred animals, snakes, slithering across their bodies. They would awaken either cured or with divine instructions on their next steps. Whether these dreams were genuine, psychosomatic, or placebo-driven, their effects were deeply felt. Greek physicians, including Hippocrates, recognized the diagnostic value of dreams. They did not dismiss them as mere fantasy. Instead, they believed the body could signal its condition through symbolic visions. A dream of flowing water might indicate kidney problems, while a dream of being crushed could point to a respiratory ailment. In Hippocratic texts, dreams were often categorized as either natural or divine. Natural dreams were attributed to diet, digestion, or emotional turmoil. Divine dreams were in a separate class, altogether direct messages from the gods or the cosmos. But not all dream interpreters were cloaked in white robes. The onirokrate, or dream readers, were the celebrities of the public square, armed with dream manuals, knowledge of omens, and a great deal of interpretive flair. They translated dreams into warnings, blessings, or directives. The most celebrated of these guides was the Onura Critica, written by Artemidorus of Daldis in the 2nd century CE, a text that remained influential for centuries. In Greece, a dream was not just a nocturnal event. It was a conduit between the mortal and the divine, the body and the soul, illness and healing. And if you were fortunate, you might awaken with a command, perhaps a snake coiled at your feet. Throughout the ancient world, one type of dream held more significance than any other: the prophetic dream. These were not just messages. They were divine warnings, revelations, or calls to action. For cultures from Mesopotamia and Egypt to Greece and beyond, prophetic dreams were considered sacred transmissions from a higher realm, direct links to the gods, to fate, or to the enigmatic workings of the cosmos. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, prophetic dreams were a recognized and revered form of divine communication. The Old Testament is rich with examples. Consider Joseph, son of Jacob, who dreamt of sheaves of wheat, bowing to his own, a clear symbol of his future ascent to power. Later, as an interpreter of Pharaoh's dreams in Egypt, he foresaw 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. That single dream of fat and thin cows altered the course of Egypt's entire economy. Joseph didn't just interpret dreams. He became a national strategist through his ability to do so. Similarly, in Mesopotamia, kings frequently received dreams that foretold victory, catastrophe, or divine approval. The Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, claimed that the gods appeared in his dreams, guiding him to success in both war and governance. Prophetic dreams were seen as a confirmation of a ruler's divine right to lead, a crucial element in a world where the distinction between king and god was often blurred. The Greeks also acknowledged this prophetic potential. Dreams were classified. Those arising from the subconscious were called anhypnia, but those that revealed truths were known as onero-aliphanoi. These were not treated lightly. Before making major decisions, founding a city, declaring war, embarking on a voyage, Greek leaders often sought guidance from dreams or from those skilled in their interpretation. Dreams were so esteemed that they had their own minor deities, the onari, winged spirits who delivered messages from the gods into the minds of sleepers. Even the typically pragmatic Romans took prophetic dreams seriously. The Emperor Augustus was said to have dreamt of his future greatness, and even Nero consulted dream interpreters during his tumultuous reign. Perhaps not enough, given the outcome. The Roman general, Scipio Africanus, before his victory over Hannibal, reportedly had a dream of triumph sent by the spirits of his ancestors. In ancient societies, prophetic dreams were not mere anecdotes. They were instruments of power, tools of policy, and proof of divine election. The destiny of nations, the stability of empires, and the rise of legends often started with nothing more than a whispered vision in the dark. While the Greek Asclepia are the most renowned examples, ancient dream incubation was not limited to Greece. In Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, the practice of dream healing flourished within a rich synthesis of Hittite, Phrygian, and later Greco-Roman traditions, with temples and sacred sites designed to facilitate contact with divine powers through sleep. The most compelling example is found in the cult of Men, a Phrygian lunar god associated with healing cycles and, naturally, with dreams. His temples were often situated on hills with a clear view of the night sky, as if to better receive lunar messages beamed down to some individuals suffering from physical ailments, spiritual turmoil, or uncertainty about their future would journey to these shrines to engage in incubation, ritualized sleep intended to produce a curative or guiding dream. The process was similar to the practices in Asclepian temples, but Anatolian incubation had its unique features. Worshippers might walk through labyrinthine paths or sleep beneath celestial carvings, believing that proximity to sacred geometry would amplify the divine. Messages, music, incense, and chanting were often used to attune the sleeper's mind to a divine frequency. This was not sleep for the purpose of rest. It was sleep as an act of spiritual reception. Texts from the region also refer to dream priests, spiritual specialists trained to guide and interpret these visions. Some would even seed dreams, suggesting specific images or symbols before sleep to help shape the encounter. For instance, a person hoping for a vision of their future child might sleep with a carved fertility symbol under their pillow. If they dreamt of a lion, the priest might interpret it as a sign of a courageous son. If they dreamt of rain, it could signify a daughter blessed with growth and wisdom. Hittite records also make reference to divine encounters in dreams, particularly among the royalty. Kings and queens received strategic advice, healing knowledge, and sometimes severe warnings from the gods in their sleep. One notable dream reportedly instructed a queen to incorporate a foreign goddess into her personal shrine, an early instance of divine diplomacy. Dream incubation in Anatolia was not just a personal experience, it was communal and cosmic. Pilgrims would travel great distances, often creating temporary healing communities united not by blood, but by shared vulnerability and hope. And through sleep they believed the gods could redirect the course of their lives. In Anatolia, to dream was not a passive state. It was an active ritual participation, where healing and prophecy emerged not from logic, but from the silent language of sleep. By the 2nd century CE, the ancient practice of dream interpretation had evolved into a structured discipline, and one man took it upon himself to systematize the entire field. Artemidorus of Daldis, a Greek from Asia Minor, Artemidorus authored the Unara Critica, the most thorough and influential dream manual of the ancient world. Unlike mystical scribes, who cloaked their work in divine mystery, Artemidorus approached dreams with the meticulous rigor of a scholar and the insightful curiosity of a street-smart psychologist. The Unara Critica was not some esoteric pamphlet. It was a 5-volume work written in clear Greek, containing thousands of dream scenarios and their interpretations, which Artemidorus compiled from personal interviews, temple archives, and public performances. He claimed to have spent decades gathering dream accounts from people of all social strata: sailors, merchants, prostitutes, and soldiers. His guiding principle was that to understand the soul of a culture, you must listen to its dreams. Even the typically pragmatic Romans took prophetic dreams seriously. The Emperor Augustus was said to have dreamt of his future greatness, and even Nero consulted dream interpreters during his tumultuous reign. Perhaps not enough, given the outcome. The Roman general Scipio Africanus, before his victory over Hannibal, reportedly had a dream of triumph sent by the spirits of his ancestors. In ancient societies, prophetic dreams were not mere anecdotes. They were instruments of power, tools of policy, and proof of divine election. The destiny of nations, the stability of empires, and the rise of legends often started with nothing more than a whispered vision in the dark. While the Greek Asclepia are the most renowned examples, ancient dream incubation was not limited to Greece. In Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, the practice of dream healing flourished within a rich synthesis of Hittite, Phrygian, and later Greco-Roman traditions, with temples and sacred sites designed to facilitate contact with divine powers through sleep. The most compelling example is found in the cult of Men, a Phrygian lunar god associated with healing cycles and, naturally, with dreams. His temples were often situated on hills with a clear view of the night sky, as if to better receive lunar messages beamed down to some individuals suffering from physical ailments, spiritual turmoil, or uncertainty about their future would journey to these shrines to engage in incubation, a ritualized sleep intended to produce a curative or guiding dream. The process was similar to the practices in Asclepian temples, but Anatolian incubation had its unique features. Worshippers might walk through labyrinthine paths or sleep beneath celestial carvings, believing that proximity to sacred geometry would amplify the divine messages. Music, incense, and chanting were often used to attune the sleeper's mind to a divine frequency. This was not sleep for the purpose of rest. It was sleep as an act of spiritual reception. Texts from the region also refer to dream priests, spiritual specialists, trained to guide and interpret these visions. Some would even seed dreams, suggesting specific images or symbols before sleep to help shape the encounter. For instance, a person hoping for a vision of their future child might sleep with a carved fertility symbol under their pillow. If they dreamt of a lion, the priest might interpret it as a sign of a courageous son. If they dreamt of rain, it could signify a daughter blessed with growth and wisdom. Hittite records also make reference to divine encounters in dreams, particularly among the royalty. Kings and queens receive strategic advice, healing knowledge, and sometimes severe warnings from the gods in their sleep. One notable dream reportedly instructed a queen to incorporate a foreign goddess into her personal shrine, an early instance of divine diplomacy. Dream incubation in Anatolia was not just a personal experience, it was communal and cosmic. Pilgrims would travel great distances, often creating temporary healing communities united not by blood, but by shared vulnerability and hope. And through sleep, they believed the gods could redirect the course of their lives. In Anatolia, to dream was not a passive state. It was an act of ritual participation, where healing and prophecy emerged not from logic, but from the silent language of sleep. By the 2nd century CE, the ancient practice of dream interpretation had evolved into a structured discipline, and one man took it upon himself to systematize the entire field. Artemidorus of Daldis, a Greek from Asia Minor, Artemidorus authored the Unera Critica, the most thorough and influential dream manual of the ancient world. Unlike mystical scribes, who cloaked their work in divine mystery, Artemidorus approached dreams with the meticulous rigor of a scholar and the insightful curiosity of a street-smart psychologist. The Unera Critica was not some esoteric pamphlet. It was a 5-volume work written in clear Greek, containing thousands of dream scenarios and their interpretations, which Artemidorus compiled from personal interviews, temple archives, and public performances. He claimed to have spent decades gathering dream accounts from people of all social strata: sailors, merchants, prostitutes, and soldiers. His guiding principle was that to understand the soul of a culture, you must listen to its dreams. He classified dreams into various categories: actions, animals, professions, bodily functions, and even types of relationships. Dreaming of flying could signify freedom or hubris. Dreaming of being naked in public might mean shame or future influence, depending on one's social standing. Dreaming of teeth falling out indicated a loss, typically of relatives, a theme that has persisted through the ages. But what sets Artemidorus apart is his emphasis on context. In contrast to earlier dream books that offered fixed meanings, Artemidorus insisted on the importance of the dreamer's status, gender, profession, and current life situation. A wealthy man dreaming of a shipwreck might face business troubles, while a poor man having the same dream could find unexpected fortune. Interpretation was not a one-size-fits-all process. It was personalized, almost like an early form of psychotherapy. Artemidorus also addressed symbolism directly. He recognized that dreams often employ metaphor and irony. A dream of dying did not necessarily portend death. It could symbolize renewal. A dream of sex was not always about desire. It could represent dominance, power dynamics, or guilt. His interpretations walk a fine line between the deeply logical and the incredibly bizarre. The Unera Critica was more than a curiosity. It was a widely used text for centuries throughout the Roman and Byzantine empires. It influenced medieval dream interpreters and was translated into Arabic, preserving its wisdom long after the fall of classical temples. With Artemidorus, the dream became a text to be analyzed and decoded, not just for prophecy, but for profound insight. He may not have believed dreams originated from the gods, but he was certain they came from a place deep, strange, and worthy of exploration. Not all dreams in the ancient world were seen as divine gifts. Some were terrors from the abyss, dark and haunting visions believed to originate from restless spirits, demonic entities, or even the underworld itself. These were not considered mere bad nights of sleep. They were grave warnings, punishments, or omens of impending doom. The Babylonians were among the first to distinguish between dreams of divine provenance and those from malevolent sources. If a dream induced fear, sickness, or distress, it was deemed polluted. A priest would be summoned to perform apotropaic rituals, cleansing spells, offerings, or symbolic acts intended to neutralize the dream's negative influence. For instance, if someone dreamt of being pursued by a demon, the interpreter might advise sleeping with a protective amulet or burning cedar wood, incense to repel evil spirits. The Egyptians also possessed a sophisticated system for nightmare prevention. Certain dreams were thought to be caused by malicious beings, including the spirits of the dead. Amulets featuring the Eye of Horus or images of Base, the dwarf god who protected households from dark forces, were worn as a defense against these nocturnal assaults. Some people even recited dream erasing spells upon waking, treating the nightmare as a contagious curse that had to be verbally banished before it could manifest in reality. In Greek thought, nightmares often conveyed messages, not from the Olympian gods, but from chthonic deities, gods of the earth and the underworld. Hades, Persephone, and even the fearsome Furies could appear in dreams to express divine anger or to signal a crime that had gone unpunished. Dreamers who ignored these warnings did so at great risk. The philosopher Plato, in the Republic, described the dream as a battleground between reason and appetite, where the lower aspects of the soul could run amok. For him, a nightmare was not just a spiritual alert, but a psychological one, an indication of an imbalanced inner self. Even the pragmatic Romans feared dreams of certain animals, such as owls, snakes, or wolves, as signs of imminent death, betrayal, or war. They believed that the dead could visit the living through dreams, sometimes to warn and sometimes to accuse. In every culture, nightmares were more than just bad dreams. They were cosmic red flags, reminders that the seen and unseen worlds were perpetually intertwined, and that even in sleep, there was no true escape from destiny. In the ancient world, dreams were not just spiritual phenomena. They were political tools. Rulers, priests, generals, and prophets frequently used dreams to justify decisions, influence public opinion, and cement their authority. When the gods spoke in dreams, those in power were quick to claim, "They spoke to me." Consider Alexander the Great. Before his conquest of Egypt, he reportedly dreamt that the god Ammon welcomed him as his son. Upon his arrival at the Siwa oasis, the local oracle confirmed the dream, proclaiming Alexander a divine being. Was the dream authentic? Was it a clever fabrication? It hardly mattered. The narrative solidified his rule and presented him as more than a living god in the eyes of his soldiers and subjects. Dreams were particularly valuable during times of political instability or uncertainty. In ancient Rome, Augustus claimed to have dreamt of his great victory at Actium, where he defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra. This dream was subsequently immortalized in literature and on coins, transforming it into a sacred national story. Later emperors adopted the same strategy. If the gods endorsed your dreams, who would dare to challenge your actions? He classified dreams into various categories: actions, animals, professions, bodily functions, and even types of relationships. Dreaming of flying could signify freedom or hubris. Dreaming of being naked in public might mean shame or future influence, depending on one's social standing. Dreaming of teeth falling out indicated a loss, typically of relatives, a theme that has persisted through the ages. But what sets Artemidorus apart is his emphasis on context. In contrast to earlier dream books that offered fixed meanings, Artemidorus insisted on the importance of the dreamer's status, gender, profession, and current life situation. A wealthy man dreaming of a shipwreck might face business troubles, while a poor man having the same dream could find unexpected fortune. Interpretation was not a one-size-fits-all process. It was personalized, almost like an early form of psychotherapy. Artemataris also addressed symbolism directly. He recognized that dreams often employ metaphor and irony. A dream of dying did not necessarily portend death. It could symbolize renewal. A dream of sex was not always about desire. It could represent dominance, power dynamics, or guilt. His interpretations walk a fine line between the deeply logical and the incredibly bizarre. The Una Recretica was more than a curiosity. It was a widely used text for centuries throughout the Roman and Byzantine empires. It influenced medieval dream interpreters and was translated into Arabic, preserving its wisdom long after the fall of classical temples. With Artemataris, the dream became a text to be analyzed and decoded, not just for prophecy, but for profound insight. He may not have believed dreams originated from the gods, but he was certain they came from a place deep, strange, and worthy of exploration. Not all dreams in the ancient world were seen as divine gifts. Some were terrors from the abyss, dark and haunting visions believed to originate from restless spirits, demonic entities, or even the underworld itself. These were not considered mere bad nights of sleep. They were grave warnings, punishments, or omens of impending doom. The Babylonians were among the first to distinguish between dreams of divine provenance and those from malevolent sources. If a dream induced fear, sickness, or distress, it was deemed polluted. A priest would be summoned to perform apotropaic rituals, cleansing spells, offerings, or symbolic acts intended to neutralize the dream's negative influence. For instance, if someone dreamt of being pursued by a demon, the interpreter might advise sleeping with a protective amulet or burning cedar wood, incense to repel evil spirits. The Egyptians also possessed a sophisticated system for nightmare prevention. Certain dreams were thought to be caused by malicious beings, including the spirits of the dead. Amulets featuring the Eye of Horus, or images of Base, the dwarf god who protected households from dark forces, were worn as a defense against these nocturnal assaults. Some people even recited dream-erasing spells upon waking, treating the nightmare as a contagious curse that had to be verbally banished before it could manifest in reality. In Greek thought, nightmares often conveyed messages not from the Olympian gods, but from chthonic deities, gods of the earth and the underworld. Hades, Persephone, and even the fearsome Furies could appear in dreams to express divine anger or to signal a crime that had gone unpunished. Dreamers who ignored these warnings did so at great risk. The philosopher Plato, in the Republic, described the dream as a battleground between reason and appetite, where the lower aspects of the soul could run amok. For him, a nightmare was not just a spiritual alert, but a psychological one, an indication of an imbalanced inner self. Even the pragmatic Romans feared dreams of certain animals, such as owls, snakes, or wolves, as signs of imminent death, betrayal, or war. They believed that the dead could visit the living through dreams, sometimes to warn and sometimes to accuse. In every culture, nightmares were more than just bad dreams. They were cosmic red flags, reminders that the seen and unseen worlds were perpetually intertwined, and that even in sleep, there was no true escape from destiny. In the ancient world, dreams were not just spiritual phenomena. They were political tools. Rulers, priests, generals, and prophets frequently used dreams to justify decisions, influence public opinion, and cement their authority. When the gods spoke in dreams, those in power were quick to claim, "They spoke to me." Consider Alexander the Great. Before his conquest of Egypt, he reportedly dreamt that the god Ammon welcomed him as his son. Upon his arrival at the Siwa oasis, the local oracle confirmed the dream, proclaiming Alexander a divine being. Was the dream authentic? Was it a clever fabrication? It hardly mattered. The narrative solidified his rule and presented him as more than a mortal, a living god in the eyes of his soldiers, and subjects. Dreams were particularly valuable during times of political instability or uncertainty. In ancient Rome, Augustus claimed to have dreamt of his great victory at Actium, where he defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra. This dream was subsequently immortalized in literature and on coins, transforming it into a sacred national story. Later, emperors adopted the same strategy. If the gods endorsed your dreams, who would dare to challenge your actions? Priests and oracles often participated in this practice. Dream interpretation became a theological instrument, especially when it served the interests of a ruler or the temple elite. If a rebellious governor dreamt of a disaster, a priest might interpret it as divine retribution for defying imperial power. Conversely, dreams of prosperity and victory, when interpreted favorably, could encourage leaders to launch military campaigns, increase taxes, or implement reforms. This was not a practice limited to men. Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt asserted in temple inscriptions that her birth was foretold in a dream by the god Amen, who appeared to her mother and prophesied her divine reign. By framing her rule as a destiny revealed in dreams, she fortified her legitimacy on a throne traditionally held by men. Prophets in the Hebrew Bible also employed dreams to challenge monarchs. Daniel, for example, interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a great statue, predicting the rise and fall of empires. This was not just dream analysis, it was geopolitics veiled in allegory. In every civilization, dreams provided leaders with a powerful claim. This is not merely my will. It is the will of heaven. Whether they were genuine divine revelations or calculated propaganda, dreams served as a potent currency, converting the subconscious into statecraft, one vision at a time. Though the ancient temples have long since turned to dust, and the priests of dream now rest beneath layers of history, the legacy of ancient dream interpretation endures, whispering through the corridors of time, science, and psychology. Much of what we believe about dreams today, our fascination with symbolism, recurring themes, and even nightmares, is rooted in ancient frameworks that sought to understand the sleeping mind. The medieval world inherited these traditions directly. Islamic scholars translated Artemidorus's Wanara Critica into Arabic, refining and expanding upon its principles. In Islamic mysticism, dreams were deeply revered as a means of divine guidance. Meanwhile, Christian monks and theologians began to compile accounts of the dreams of saints and martyrs, visions that often foretold miracles or divine retribution. The fundamental structure persisted: sleep as a gateway to the sacred, dreams as coded messages, and interpreters as the link between the human and the divine. Fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries, and we encounter Sigmund Freud, who, despite rejecting religious interpretations, drew heavily on the symbolic structures pioneered millennia earlier. In The Interpretation of Dreams, 1899, Freud proposed that dreams were expressions of repressed desires and fears. Yet he employed ancient tools like metaphor, symbol, and narrative. His protege Carl Jung took this further, describing the dream world as inhabited by archetypes, universal figures such as the shadow, the hero, and the wise old man, which bear a striking resemblance to the figures found in a Greek temple or a Babylonian omen text. Even modern neuroscience, while demystifying dreams, still acknowledges their complexity. Concepts like REM sleep, lucid dreaming, and the impact of trauma on dream content echo ancient beliefs that dreams reflect both the health of the body and the state of the soul. Pop culture also continues this tradition, from film and literature to tarot and New Age spirituality. Dreams remain a source of endless fascination. Whether it's a horror movie based on sleep paralysis or a dream journal app that promises self-discovery, the ancient idea that what we experience in sleep is significant still resonates. In the end, the ancients may not have had brain scans or sleep laboratories, but they grasped something we are still pursuing today. Dreams are not random. They are stories, signals, or shadows, whispered in the language of God's ancestors, or our own inner selves. The question remains the same across the ages. What is your dream trying to tell you? In the mid-19th century, the United States was a nation straining at its geographical limits. By 1860, California had been a state for a decade, yet it often felt more like a distant relation than an integral part of the family. The eastern half of the country was a network of bustling cities, telegraph lines, and railroads, while the western frontier was a vast, rugged, and painfully isolated expanse. A letter sent from New York to San Francisco could take 4 weeks to arrive, and sometimes longer if it encountered storms, delays, or bandits. And that was assuming it arrived at all. Mail routes of the era were as inefficient as they were complex. The most common method involved ships transporting mail down the Atlantic, across the Isthmus of Panama, and then up the Pacific coast, a journey fraught with delays, tropical illnesses, and logistical chaos. The overland route by was slow, dangerous, and frequently obstructed by mud, snow-blocked passes, or attacks from outlaws. This communication delay was more than an inconvenience. It was a political crisis. The federal government feared that California, feeling increasingly disconnected, might drift away in loyalty or even secede. In a period when the threat of secession was already looming, preserving national unity was not just a goal, it was an urgent necessity. Entrepreneurs and visionaries began to propose audacious solutions. None more so than the idea of a central relay system that utilized the American West's most abundant resources: open space and swift horses. If skilled riders could traverse the country in shifts, exchanging horses at stations every 10 to 15 miles, they might be able to reduce the delivery time from weeks to just 10 days. It was an audacious proposal. The route would cover nearly 2,000 miles, from St. Joseph, Missouri, to Sacramento, California, crossing mountains, deserts, rivers, and largely unmapped territories. Riders would face extreme heat, freezing temperatures, and the constant threat of ambush. But if it succeeded, it would establish the fastest communication link between the East and West. The problem was, America was growing faster than its infrastructure. And so, with a combination of desperation, ambition, and sheer frontier audacity, a solution galloped into history, one mail pouch at a time. The Pony Express was about to be born. The Pony Express did not simply emerge from the dust. It was the creation of 3 ambitious entrepreneurs from the freighting firm of Russell, Majors, and Waddell. Based in Missouri, the trio William H. Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell were already seasoned veterans of the overland shipping industry. Their company was responsible for transporting freight and government supplies across the untamed frontier. But in 1860, they aimed for a far more radical objective: to deliver mail to California in the shortest time imaginable. At that moment, Russell, in particular, was under considerable pressure. His reputation had been tarnished by financial scandals and unsuccessful ventures. He viewed the Pony Express not just as a patriotic endeavor but as a chance for personal redemption, a way to restore his name and curry favor with the government. If they could demonstrate that their relay system was viable, they hoped to secure a profitable federal mail contract. Alexander Majors was the logistical mastermind. A devout and meticulous organizer, he insisted on strict discipline from his employees, requiring riders and station masters to take an oath against drinking and swearing. He also devised a highly organized system for the express. Relay stations would be established every 10 to 15 miles, with larger home stations every 75 to 100 miles, and the entire operation would be run with military precision. William B. Waddell, the most reserved of the 3, provided the legal and financial foundation, while Russell was the visionary salesman and Majors the operational expert. Waddell managed the finances and worked to keep the company solvent, at least for a time. Together, The three men invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into the venture. They acquired over 400 horses, hired more than 80 riders, and constructed approximately 190 stations across some of the most remote parts of the frontier. They were aware of the immense risk and the grueling nature of the route. But they also knew that whoever solved the communication crisis would secure a lasting place in American history. And so, without any government funding, they launched the service themselves. It was a bold, financially reckless, and logistically daunting move, yet it perfectly embodied the spirit of American grit. In April of 1860, the Pony Express was poised to ride. The race against time and terrain had begun. Establishing the Pony Express route was like constructing a delicate bridge across a continent without a safety net or any room for error. The full journey spanned nearly 2,000 miles, from St. Joseph, Missouri, to Sacramento, California, through a breathtaking variety of landscapes, rolling plains, formidable mountain ranges, high deserts, and perilous river crossings. To make this incredible vision a reality, the founders established a chain of around 190 relay stations, positioned every 10 to 15 miles. The approximate distance a horse could gallop at top speed before needing rest. Every 75 to 100 miles. A larger home station offered rest and provisions for the riders, where they could sleep, eat, and transfer the mail to a fresh rider. But the true foundation of the Express was its horses, more than 400 in total. They were selected not for their appearance, but for their exceptional speed and endurance. On the eastern prairies, swift-footed thoroughbreds were used. In the rugged west, hardy and compact Mustangs carried the mail over mountains and deserts. These were the Ferraris of the frontier. Riders would gallop at full speed, dismount mid-stride, and leap onto a fresh horse in a matter of seconds. Each station had to be staffed, supplied, and secured. Some were no more than simple sod huts or wooden shacks, while others were fortified buildings protected by fences and armed station keepers. All necessary supplies, water, feed, and food, had to be transported in advance. This required months of preparation in some of the most remote and inhospitable parts of America. Weather was one of the greatest challenges. Riders faced snowstorms in the Sierra Nevada, sandstorms in the Utah desert, and oppressive summer heat. On the Nebraska plains, wild animals, swollen rivers, and treacherous trails were constant hazards. And then there were the human threats: bandits, outlaws, and the growing tensions with Native American tribes. Yet, despite the chaos, the system worked, with riders changing every 75 to 100 miles and horses being swapped every 10 to 15 miles. The mail traversed the continent in as little as 10 days, a revolutionary speed for the time. It was a logistical marvel, held together by courage, sweat, and sheer determination. In a land where distance meant isolation, the Pony Express wove a fragile thread of connection, one hoofbeat at a time. On April 3, 1860, the Pony Express made its celebrated debut. In St. Joseph, Missouri, a crowd gathered at the Pikes Peak stables, electric with anticipation. The first rider, widely believed to be Johnny Fry, mounted his horse, took hold of the Mosiala, a specially crafted leather mail pouch, and galloped westward at a blistering pace. The crowd erupted in cheers. Cannons were fired, and a new era in American history began with a thunder of hooves. The mailbag Fry carried weighed about 20 pounds and was filled with letters, newspapers, and telegrams destined for California. A telegraph message from Washington, D.C. had been included, set to travel the remainder of its journey on horseback, symbolizing the fusion of modern technology and raw human determination. At that very moment, a rider in Sacramento began a parallel journey eastward, initiating the bidirectional relay. Between them lay nearly 2,000 miles of wilderness, 190 stations, and some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. Their goal was to cross it in a mere 10 days. Each rider along the route would carry the mochila from one station to the next, dismounting a tired horse and leaping onto a fresh one in under 2 minutes. The mochila was a marvel of design. It had 4 locked pouches and could be swiftly transferred over the saddle horn without any need for unstrapping. Speed was paramount. Riders were expected to maintain an average pace of 10 miles per hour, even in the dead of night, through rain, snow, or hostile territory. Despite the immense challenges, the inaugural ride was a resounding success. The mail from Missouri arrived in Sacramento in just 9 days and 23 hours. It was a triumph. Newspapers celebrated it as a marvel of modern communication, and the legend of the Pony Express was born almost instantly. Although only a handful of letters were carried in that first mochila, the symbolic significance was enormous. It was about more than just delivering mail. It was about demonstrating that this vast, fragmented continent could be connected. That man and horse could overcome isolation. For the riders, it was the start of a perilous and thrilling chapter. For the nation, it was a glimpse of a new future communication, faster than anyone had thought possible. The West had just become a little smaller. The true heart of the Pony Express was not its horses, its stations, or even its iconic mochila. It was the riders, a courageous group of young, resilient daredevils who challenged weather, wilderness, and war to deliver the mail. They were more than just couriers. They were living legends in the making. The typical Pony Express rider was no older than 18, and often as young as 16. They were required to be lightweight, usually under 125 pounds, to maximize the speed of their horses. The now famous recruitment ad supposedly read, "Wanted young, skinny, wiry fellows, not over 18, must be expert riders, willing to risk death daily, orphans preferred." While the exact wording is likely an embellishment, the sentiment was entirely accurate. These young men rode for 75 to 100 miles per shift, changing horses at each station but never stopping until they had passed the mochila to the next rider. They frequently rode at night, through torrential downpours, blinding snowstorms, or searing heat. They were equipped with revolvers and rifles, but their primary defense against bandits or hostile attacks was their speed. Many traveled alone, relying solely on their ability to outrun danger. Some of these riders became folk heroes. Pony Bob Haslam once rode 380 miles in under 2 days to deliver mail during a violent Paiute uprising, completing his route despite being wounded by arrows. William Buffalo Bill Cody, who would later achieve fame as a Wild West showman, claimed to have ridden for the Express at the age of 15, though historians question the veracity of this tale. Regardless, the reality of their work was dramatic enough. Riders had to traverse the Rocky Mountains, cross the Great Basin Desert, and venture through territories where a single misstep could lead to freezing, drowning, or disappearing without a trace. Yet the service maintained an incredible record of reliability. Only one mochila was ever reported lost. Despite the constant danger, many riders embraced the job. They were paid well for the era, $100 to $150 a month, a substantial sum for a teenager, and they cherished the thrill, the speed, and the sense of mission. They weren't just transporting mail. They were uniting a nation. The riders of the Pony Express were more than messengers. They became symbols of American courage, resilience, and determination, galloping through myth and memory with every hoofbeat. And for 18 unforgettable months, they proved that no frontier was too vast to be conquered. Riding for the Pony Express was not just a job. It was a daily confrontation with mortality. The riders faced a relentless series of dangers that would have deterred most grown men. Yet these mostly teenage boys pressed on through the fury of nature, armed adversaries, and a landscape that often seemed intent on consuming them. One of the most significant threats was the environment itself. Riders endured blizzards in the Sierra Nevada, scorching heat across the Nevada desert, and sudden thunderstorms that could turn rivers into raging torrents or trails into impassable mire. A fall from a horse in freezing weather could result in hypothermia, while a misjudgment in a swollen river could be fatal. Then there were the animals. Packs of wolves occasionally pursued riders in the dead of night. Rattlesnakes lay coiled in the brush along the trails, and mountain lions haunted the high mountain passes. But even more dangerous than the wildlife were the bandits and highwaymen, who knew the mochila contained valuable correspondence, sometimes including gold dust or money orders. Although riders were armed with revolvers, they were often outnumbered, and stopping to fight meant risking both their lives and their mission. Tensions with Native American tribes also escalated during the Pony Express's short existence. The Paiute War of 1860, ignited by disputes over land and broken treaties, resulted in several attacks on Pony Express stations. Riders were ambushed, station keepers were killed, and multiple stations were burned to the ground. The most famous incident involved Pony Bob Haslam, who galloped nearly 190 miles through hostile territory to deliver the mail, suffering arrow wounds but managing to complete his route. Even isolation was a formidable danger. Riders were alone, for hours on end, with only their horse, their weapon, and the vast, dark wilderness for company. A broken bone, an injured horse, or a missed station could mean dying alone, never to be found. And yet they rode on. Despite all these perils, the system held. Mail was sometimes delayed, but rarely lost. Riders were occasionally injured, but they almost always completed their journey. In 18 months of operation, only a handful of men lost their lives on the job. The Pony Express was not a romanticized fantasy of the Wild West. It was a brutal and often terrifying reality. But by overcoming these dangers, the riders became legends, proving that even the most unforgiving terrain could be tamed, if only for long enough to deliver the mail. Although the Pony Express operated for only 18 months, its influence on the United States was immediate, extensive, and undeniably significant. In a nation on the brink of civil war, desperate to feel connected across its vast territory, the Express delivered a clear and powerful message. Distance was no longer an insurmountable barrier. Before the Pony Express, it took weeks for mail to travel from the East Coast to California. Crucial political news, business deals, and personal correspondence often arrived too late to be relevant. But with the Express, mail could reach San Francisco in just 10 days. Suddenly, Californians were no longer isolated from the rest of the country. Businesses became more ambitious. Newspapers could provide near real-time updates from across the nation. Families felt more connected, and, most critically, the Union felt more unified as the Civil War approached. Politically, the Express also demonstrated to the federal government that the West was within its reach. It became a symbol of national strength and cohesion at a time when fragmentation seemed imminent. President James Buchanan received regular updates from California during the tense period leading up to Abraham Lincoln's election, partly thanks to the Express. Economically, it helped establish the foundation for transcontinental infrastructure. The stations built across remote areas later became sites for railroads, telegraph lines, and stagecoach routes. Many of the Pony Express trails were eventually integrated into more permanent communication networks. What began as a bold gamble became the blueprint for connecting America from coast to coast. Culturally, the Pony Express became the very embodiment of the frontier spirit. Newspapers romanticized the riders, creating instant folk heroes. Young men across the country dreamt of taking up the reins and galloping through danger with a saddlebag full of destiny. The Express was mythologized even while it was still in operation, capturing the imagination of a nation eager for symbols of courage and unity. Long after it ceased to exist, the Pony Express continued to shape American identity. It represented speed, bravery, sacrifice, and, above all, possibility. In just over a year, it achieved what steamships Congress and diplomacy had failed to do. It made a sprawling, fractured nation feel like one. The Pony Express didn't just deliver mail. It delivered the future, one gallop at a time. For all its audacity and success, the Pony Express was destined for a short life from its very inception. It wasn't a question of failure, but of technological advancement. As fast as a horse could gallop, it could never compete with the speed of an electrical impulse. Just 2 days after the Pony Express officially began its service in April 1860, construction started on the Transcontinental Telegraph, a coast-to-coast communication system that would transmit messages in minutes instead of days. The telegraph poles and wires advanced steadily, moving westward from the Missouri River and eastward from California. Each mile of wire laid was another nail in the coffin of the express. On October 24, 1861, just 18 months after the first ride, the final telegraph wire was connected, completing the link across the country. The system became operational, and the connection was instantaneous. On that very day, the Pony Express carried its last mail pouch. The sound of hoofbeats was replaced by the rhythmic click of Morse code. But even before the telegraph's completion, the Pony Express was facing financial ruin. Despite its legendary performance, it was a commercial disaster. Russell, Majors and Waddell had invested over $700,000 in the operation and had recouped only a fraction of that amount. With no federal subsidy and exorbitant operational costs for horses, riders, station maintenance, and supply logistics, the Express was never a financially viable business. It was conceived as a proof of concept, a bold demonstration intended to secure a mail contract that never fully materialized. Russell himself became embroiled in a financial scandal, and the company began to crumble. By the time the telegraph was finished, the Express was already on its last legs, heroic, beloved, but utterly obsolete. Yet, the end was met with little bitterness. The very goal the Pony Express had set out to achieve, proving that rapid, coast-to-coast communication was possible, had been realized. The riders moved on to other frontier occupations. The stations were repurposed or abandoned, and the nation's focus shifted to the future. The fall of the Pony Express was not a failure. It was a passing of the torch. The horse gave way to the wire, just as the wire would eventually yield to radio, satellites, and the internet. But for one brief, brilliant moment, America watched in awe as teenage boys and powerful horses conquered time and distance. In a world obsessed with speed, the Pony Express galloped into legend, leaving hoofprints that no telegraph wire could ever erase. Though it existed for only 18 months, the Pony Express galloped directly into the mythology of the American West, becoming one of the most enduring and romanticized narratives in the nation's history. In reality, it was a high-risk, short-lived commercial enterprise. But in the collective imagination, it transformed into something much grander, a symbol of heroism, speed, and the indomitable frontier spirit. Hollywood dime novels and school textbooks elevated the Express to legendary status. The image of a lone rider silhouetted against a sunset, thundering across the prairie with a leather mail pouch and a six-shooter, captured the heart of the nation. This was more than just nostalgia. It was national identity in motion. At a time when America was still forging its identity, the Pony Express provided a story of courage, sacrifice, and unity in the face of adversity. Figures like Pony Bob Haslam and Buffalo Bill Cody became frontier celebrities. Cody, whether he actually rode for the Express or not, leveraged the legend in his Wild West shows, cementing the image of the fearless teenage courier in the minds of millions around the world. The Express became a shorthand for grit, audacity, and everything Americans wanted to believe about their pioneering past. Monuments soon followed. Statues of galloping riders now stand in cities along the old trail, from St. Joseph to Sacramento. Highways and recreational trails trace the original route. Reenactments, museum exhibitions, and historical tours keep the memory alive. Even the U.S. Postal Service has issued Pony Express stamps, honoring the brief but bold endeavor that helped unite the nation. But the story endures for a more profound reason. The Pony Express serves as a reminder of a moment in history when human resilience raced against the obstacles of nature. When communication required risk and connection demanded courage. It tells us that speed once came not from satellites, but from sheer determination and a willingness to ride through snow, desert, and darkness with nothing but a horse and a dream. In our age of instant messaging and global networks, it is easy to forget how difficult communication once was. The Pony Express stands as a tribute to those who bridged impossible distances, not with fiber optics or electricity, but with muscle, grit, and a pounding heartbeat. Its legend persists, not because it lasted, but because for a brief and shining moment, it outran the impossible. The earliest known beer was not served in a chilled mug or a branded bottle. It originated in a clay pot in a Sumerian village thousands of years ago. Long before the rise of Rome or the construction of the pyramids, the people of ancient Mesopotamia, particularly the Sumerians, were brewing beer in ways that were both simple and sacred. And they weren't just drinking it, they were venerating it. In Sumerian society, beer was not merely a casual drink. It was a dietary staple, a form of payment, a religious offering, and a hallmark of civilization. It is no coincidence that the oldest written recipe in human history is not for bread or soup, but for beer. Discovered on clay tablets dating to around 1800 BCE. The hymn to Ninkasi praises the goddess of beer, while simultaneously providing brewing instructions in poetic form. Ninkasi was no minor deity, she was revered. To brew beer was to summon her presence. The brewing process was both practical and poetic. The Sumerians would bake a special type of bread called bapir, made from barley and often sweetened with honey or dates. This bread was then crumbled into jars of water and allowed to ferment naturally. The resulting beverage was nothing like modern beer. It was thick, cloudy, and low in alcohol, more akin to a nutritious gruel. And it was vital to daily life. Water in the ancient world was frequently contaminated, but beer, due to its fermentation, was a safer option. It was rich in calories and nutrients, making it an essential part of the diet for laborers, priests, and royalty. Workers on temple construction projects or irrigation canals were often paid in beer rations, which could amount to several liters per day. Socially, beer was a communal affair. Instead of drinking from individual cups, people would often gather around large ceramic vessels and sip through long reed straws to filter out the sediment. It was not just about intoxication. It was about community, survival, and honoring the gods. In many respects, beer helps to define what it meant to be Sumerian. It was deeply integrated into rituals, legal codes, agriculture, and the economy. It was liquid civilization, both a daily necessity and a sacred act. And it laid the groundwork for brewing cultures across the ancient world. From the banks of the Tigris to the shores of the Nile. If the Sumerians provided beer with its spiritual origins, the Egyptians were the ones who industrialized it. By the time the Old Kingdom was flourishing along the Nile, beer had become more than a sacred beverage. It was a cornerstone of Egyptian society, woven into every aspect of life. From daily meals to divine offerings and funerary practices, Egyptian beer was brewed on a scale that far surpassed earlier methods. At large temples and palace complexes, massive breweries functioned as part of the state economy. In fact, beer production was often managed by religious institutions. The Egyptians believed that beer was a gift from Osiris, the god of agriculture and fertility, and it played a prominent role in ceremonies dedicated to deities like Hathor, the goddess of music, joy, and fertility, who was frequently associated with intoxication and revelry. The brewing process was similar to that of the Sumerians, but had evolved in both technique and scale. Bread made from immer wheat or barley was partially baked, crumbled into large vats, and mixed with water. Dates or honey were added for sweetness, and the mixture was left to ferment in ceramic jars. The resulting beverage was thick, unfiltered, and highly nutritious, sometimes consumed with a spoon rather than sipped. Beer was not just for the living. Tombs were furnished with jars of beer for the afterlife, alongside loaves of bread and cuts of meat. Beer was considered so fundamental that a respectable journey to the next world was unimaginable without it. Recipes for the dead, lists of beer offerings to the gods, and murals depicting the brewing process all underscore its spiritual significance. But beer also fueled the labor force. The workers who constructed the pyramids were not slaves. They were paid laborers, and part of their daily rations consisted of beer, sometimes as much as 4 liters a day. This was not an indulgence. It was hydration, nutrition, and a morale booster all in one. One archaeologist even referred to it as the ancient Egyptian energy drink. The state maintained strict control over its production and distribution. Taxes were collected in the form of beer, and its quality was regulated. Women, particularly priestesses and temple workers, were often involved in brewing, reinforcing its connection to both domestic life and sacred power. In short, beer in Egypt was not a footnote, it was central. It nourished the people, placated the gods, and filled the tombs. And like the Nile itself, it flowed through every part of Egyptian life. Throughout ancient civilizations, beer was more than just a drink. It was a form of divine communion. Its frothy presence was a welcome addition to temples, funerals, and festivals. Fermentation was not viewed as a chemical reaction but as a mystical process, a gift from the gods that transformed simple grain into a sacred liquid. To brew beer was to engage with the spiritual realm, and to drink it was to partake in something beyond mere sustenance. In Sumer, the goddess Ninkasi personified this connection. Her hymn was both a prayer and a set of instructions, an act of devotion and a guide to sacred brewing. Rituals likely commenced with chants to invoke her presence before fermentation began. It is believed that the finished beer was shared as part of temple offerings, given to priests, and even poured out in libations to the gods themselves. In Egypt, the spiritual significance of beer was even more deeply ingrained in the religious culture. Temples brewed their own beer for daily offerings, sometimes dedicating hundreds of jars at a time. During the annual festival of drunkenness, worshippers celebrated the myth of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of destruction, who was tricked into drinking beer dyed red to resemble blood. The result was that her bloodlust was pacified, and humanity was saved. A powerful story illustrating how beer was seen as a force capable of taming divine wrath. Priests and priestesses were actively involved in the brewing process, and many religious texts mention specific ritual brews created for ceremonies. The presence of beer in funerary rites was also crucial, as it was believed to sustain the soul on its journey to the afterlife. Some tomb inscriptions even specify precise beer offerings alongside prayers and hymns. In the ancient world, beer was the great unifier. Everyone drank it, but not everyone drank the same kind. Just as with food, clothing, and language, beer both reflected and reinforced the rigid social hierarchies of the time. While commoners consumed thick, hearty brews for survival, the elites transformed beer into a status symbol, a ritual offering, and sometimes even a political instrument. Among the Sumerians and Akkadians, workers were given daily beer rations. Their brews were dark, unfiltered, and dense, more like a stew than a drink, but incredibly nourishing. These were functional beers, designed to sustain laborers in hot, arid climates. Yet, even here, there were distinctions. Some tablets mention at least 9 different types of beer, ranked by quality and purpose. The superior versions were often reserved for scribes, priests, or administrators. demonstrating that beer was already being used to delineate class distinctions. In Egypt, the contrast was even more pronounced. While ordinary Egyptians drank a thick beer made from or wheat and flavored with dates, the wealthy enjoyed refined brews that were lighter, sweeter, and sometimes filtered. Tomb paintings depict nobles holding goblets of golden beer, seated under palm fronds, while servants pour from elegant jars. For the upper classes, beer was not just for sustenance. It was an aesthetic pleasure. Pharaohs and their families received daily offerings of beer, often alongside wine and bread. These libations were not mere tradition. They were a reflection of power. Only the rich could afford dedicated brewing staff, access to the finest ingredients, and the leisure to enjoy beer recreationally, rather than relying on it for calories. Beer also served diplomatic and ceremonial roles during feasts, treaty signings, and religious festivals. Offering high-quality beer was a sign of wealth and respect, while not offering beer could be interpreted as an insult. Interestingly, the brewing profession itself mirrored this social divide. In homes and villages, women or slaves typically brewed the family's supply. But in temples or elite households, professional brewers, who were sometimes trained and salaried, managed production. The beer that came from temple vats was better regulated, more heavily taxed, and more politically significant. So, while beer was a universal drink, its taste, texture, and meaning varied dramatically depending on one's social standing. For some, it was daily fuel. For others, it was an expression of divinity, wealth, and refinement. In every jar, ancient beer carried not just flavor, but a quiet signature of social status. Foaming at the rim, though thousands of years have passed since Sumerian priestesses chanted to Ninkasi, or Egyptian workers sipped beer under the shadows of the pyramids, the legacy of ancient brewing continues to live on in our recipes, rituals, economies, and cultural memory. Beer, perhaps more than any other beverage, connects us to the earliest expressions of civilization. Modern brewing is deeply indebted to the ancient world. Many techniques that we now take for granted, malting grain, fermenting with wild yeast, flavoring with herbs or fruit, were pioneered by brewers who had no microscopes or thermometers. Instead, they relied on intuition, tradition, and a process of trial and error, guided by oral wisdom and spiritual reverence. These methods laid the foundation for what would eventually become scientific brewing in later eras. The ancient attitude toward beer also persists in cultural traditions. In places like Ethiopia, Peru, and rural Eastern Europe, communities still brew beer in ceramic vessels, often using age-old recipes passed down through families, echoes of Sumerian and Egyptian kitchens. In these places, brewing is not just a hobby or a business. It is a ritual of community, just as it was 5,000 years ago. The symbolic power of beer has also endured. Festivals, holidays, and social gatherings around the world still feature beer as a central offering, a drink of celebration, bonding, and identity. Even the communal pint at the pub carries the same spirit as the ancient Sumerian clay pot shared with reed straws. Beer as a bridge between people. Academically, the study of ancient brewing has given rise to a growing field known as bioarchaeology. Through residue analysis, scientists have reconstructed ancient beer recipes, brewed them, and even sold them commercially. Experimental archaeology. Projects have successfully brewed beer from ancient Egyptian tomb recipes, offering modern people a literal taste of history. Perhaps most importantly, ancient beer reminds us that civilization was not built solely on conquest, stone, or steel. It was also built in kitchens and breweries, by ordinary people who transformed grain and water into sustenance, economy, and culture. It was made by women, consumed by workers, and offered to gods. So, the next time you raise a glass, remember that you are not just drinking a beverage. You are participating in one of humanity's oldest and most universal rituals, a Legacy brewed over millennia and still fermenting in every corner of the world.